2 weeks ago, a school shooting happened in Indonesia, injuring several kids at a school in North Jakarta. And at first, the authorities were actually alarmed. A school shooting in Jakarta? How could that be possible? Is probably what the police was thinking when they rushed to the school. The police immediately sent the Indonesian SWAT to deal with the threat. And these Indonesian SWAT was probably anticipating a full-blown firefight in the school after years of shooting and apprehending road bandits who are only armed with machetes. And the Indonesian SWAT, well, they mean business. And instead, when they arrived at the school, they get the scrawny kids from the slums armed with what looked like real guns but were actually airsoft guns. And the police quickly made short work of the quote-unquote active shooter. And there were unclear facts as to how the police apprehended the shooter, but some sources say that while he was shot by the SWAT team, others say he injured himself in an explosion, while others claim he simply fell down a flight of stairs while running away from the SWAT team. But anyways, the police found another thing. They discovered that apparently an explosion was set off in the school's praying grounds moments before the kid went postal. And this explosion injured several kids. 94 kids, to be exact, are injured in the attack. He knew that the mosque would be crowded because his fellow students were having the Islamic Friday praying, which, mind you, is mandatory as a Muslim. So he maximized the attack on a crowded area. Well, this kid is full-on diabolical. Not long after that, the police also discovered that apparently the kid bombed his own canteen. So he had a total of 2 explosives he used to bomb his school. So the victims were evacuated, the teachers and staff were put into questioning, and the perpetrator was quickly taken into police custody. And speaking to my viewers, I rarely talk about crime, laws, or felony inside my videos because, well, as you know, I'm a political commentator first and foremost. But reading the details of this incident, I was actually pretty shocked. The details of this crime and the background of the perpetrator was so interesting, but at the same time, so disturbing because Indonesia never had a crime like this before, and I'm sure many Indonesians know exactly why I'm saying this. It read like something out of 4chan in that one Netflix movie called Adolescence. It is literally the movie Adolescence, but turned up all the way to 11. And I feel like it would be a crime not to discuss about this incident and what I think of it, especially the nature surrounding this incident. I'm here not to claim facts since investigation is technically still underway, but I'm here merely to provide an observation on everything that has transpired. And because the incident was still very recent and Indonesian families are still shaken by this, I will try and refrain from making jokes about this incident. So, without further ado, let's move on with this discussion. Indonesians were stunned by this case due to a number of reasons. First was because it was one of the rarest instances of violence against a school in Indonesia. While student-on-student violence was common, especially back before social media and stricter child supervision, violence against the school itself and the mass student body was quite rare. With the last instance of this happening was in 2000 in Poso, South Sulawesi, when Christian terrorists, yes, Christian terrorists, started attacking an Islamic community in Poso, where they also murdered children in an Islamic boarding school. Second, because of the motives. What motives could the perpetrator have against the school to react so violently, and why was Indonesia so shocked? The attacker had been radicalized by Western far-right extremism and the culture surrounding school shooters, a motive so bizarre that most Indonesians simply couldn't understand it. And we are so far removed from the political conflict of the digital Anglosphere that it really felt alien. His airsoft gun, which was found next to his body, was painted with white lettering, and police discovered the paint references to Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, the Columbine shooters, Breton Tarrant, the Christchurch terrorist, neo-Nazi iconography, white supremacist symbols, Reuters, and even references to Agartha, a mythical land often associated with Western occult and fringe conspiracy theories that was hijacked by the Nazis. And yes, judging from what he wore to school, it was definite that his intentions were to cause shock value in itself. When the bombing took place, the students and some of the staff mentions that the boy was wearing black boots, black slacks, and a white shirt with the word natural selection. For those who remember the Columbine shooting in 1999, that phrase was printed on the shirt worn by Eric Harris during the attack, captured in the school's CCTV footage of the shooting. It wasn't an accident. He deliberately recreated the look of one of the most infamous school shooters in history. So, looking at the profile of the boy, it was obvious that this wasn't just some troubled kid. This was someone who immersed himself in the darkest corners of the internet. Corners Indonesia isn't culturally familiar with. Corners Indonesia aren't prepared to deal with. So, how could something so disconnected from Indonesia's own politics or social realities radicalize him to this deeply? To fully understand how he ended up here, we also need to look at what was happening inside the school. Several classmates and teachers have described him as a loner or a freak, isolated and socially awkward. He would watch and show one of those Gore cartel or ISIS execution videos on his phone and drew so much violence and guns in his book, leading him to be labeled as weird. And because of that, he was reportedly bullied. And in some cases, I can understand why his bullies bullied him. He was one strange kid, but I wouldn't condone the actions of the bullies. I don't think that being weird warrants you getting bullied by your entire school, because when has being different from the rest of the group is a crime? For your information, I was often mistreated at my elementary school. The kids often bullied me because I often like playing alone with my blocks and also read manga and watch anime in a time where people think you're committing a moral sin just by doing that. Provided I wasn't strange like the other kid, but I was definitely different. And I still got picked on. But returning to the issue at hand, there were claims that the perpetrator did report his bullying to his teachers, but many people believe that the teachers didn't do anything to stop the bullying from happening. As the investigation is still ongoing, we can't really come to a conclusion about this, but based on my assumption of how schools often treat weird kids, his issue wasn't taken seriously. And of course, after watching adolescents and seeing how many school shooters in real life are isolated, weird kids who felt no one accepted them or took their problems seriously, he likely saw himself in that narrative. Kids like that often start searching for validation and a sense of power anywhere they can find it. And when the real world keeps rejecting these kids, they turn to ideologies online that frame violence as empowerment or even revenge. These beliefs give them a twisted sense of purpose, strength to strike back at the people they believe wronged or humiliated them. And this is exactly why far-right ideologies are so effective at radicalizing kids like him. Research from the International Center for the Study of Radicalization and Journal of Adolescence shows that young men who feel socially excluded are significantly more vulnerable to extremist narratives because those narratives mirror their own emotional state, which is victimhood, resentment, isolation, and the promise of righteous retaliation. We've seen this pattern over and over again. The Columbine shooters even framed themselves as victims of a hostile school environment. The Christchurch attacker published a manifesto claiming that he was defending civilization. Even the Buffalo supermarket shooter described himself in online forums as an outcast seeking purpose. Major headlines around the world consistently highlight the same arc. A lonely young man bullied or excluded finds refugee in extremist ideology online and interprets violence as empowerment. And that's exactly what these ideologies are designed to do. They tell angry, isolated young men that they are secretly superior, that society has betrayed them, and that violence is a legitimate means to reclaim dignity or power. Studies from RAND Corporation and Oxford Internet Institute have documented how far-right communities on platforms like 4chan and Telegram weaponize grievance. They take ordinary teenage frustration and elevate it into an ideological crusade. And for someone feeling used to being invisible and mocked, this becomes an intoxicating thing. In these online echo chambers, they're no longer just a bullied kid. They're recast as a soldier, a martyr, and a symbol in some imaginary war against a vague enemy that they paint those who wrong them as. Far-right extremism offers them a story where their suffering feels meaningful and their hatred feels justified. It turns their personal grudges into a political mission and for vulnerable teenagers looking for identity. So, Indonesia needs to begin addressing and taking this issue seriously. Radicalism in the 2020s is not only left wing or communist like what Indonesia is used to, nor religious extremism. Alien ideologies that Indonesia has no experience facing is bleeding into vulnerable youths seeking for help. If an Indonesian school shooting were driven by Western far-right extremism, chronic bullying, and online radicalization, it would mark a disturbing shift for the nation. It would show that Indonesia is no longer insulated from the psychological machinery behind tragedies like Columbine, Parkland, or Uvalde, where isolated young men reframe their personal humiliation into an ideological violence. This mirrors findings by psychologists like Peter Langman, who notes that many shooters adopt extremist labels not out of deep conviction, but because these narratives give them identity, power, and a sense that their rage is also righteous. It also aligns with strain theory, which argues that when young people feel blocked from belonging or respect, which is common in Indonesian schools where bullying is often dismissed as kids just horsing around, they may seek meaning in deviant ideologies that validate their resentment. For Indonesia, such a case would be painfully relatable because the emotional ingredients already exist here. Widespread bullying, teens who feel invisible at school, and an online sphere filled with incel rhetoric, far-right memes, and extremist Telegram channels that mirror Western echo chambers. A tragedy like this would reveal how globalized and porous Indonesian youth culture has become, shaped as much by TikTok, YouTube, Discord, and Reddit as by local norms or a lack of parent supervision. It would force the nation to confront that extremism today doesn't spread through organized cells but through neglected emotions, algorithmic feeds, and ideology that often turn a lonely, overlooked teenager into someone who sees violence not just as retaliation but as destiny. Indonesia's reaction to this incident exposed a deeper cultural blind spot. Instead of confronting the real causes, which is online radicalization, bullying, and the rise of Western far-right ideology, the government immediately defaulted to blaming violent video games. PUBG, of all things. It felt like watching a rerun of early 2000s America when politicians claimed that Grand Theft Auto was turning kids into criminals, despite the American Psychological Association and Oxford repeatedly finding no causal link between violent video games and real-world violence. But Indonesia isn't ready to face the uncomfortable truth that is, our Asian family values aren't enough to shield children from the globalized digital world. Parents assume kids are safe simply because they're physically at home, when in reality, mentally immersed in online spaces, Indonesian adults don't understand and worse, have zero cultural literacy to interpret. That lack of understanding became painfully obvious when national TV casually read aloud the perpetrator's notebook, including the N-word with a hard R, without any awareness of the term's history or weight. This wasn't malice. It was the pinnacle of ignorance. And that's precisely the problem. Indonesia keeps trying to slap a band-aid on a wound that needs stitching. Instead of addressing the bullying that was ignored, the emotional neglect that went unseen, or the extremist echo chambers that filled the void, we blame the nearest easy target, which is video games, social media, Western movies, anything to avoid ourselves from real accountability to the issue. That we have no institutional framework to counter Western digital extremism and no emotional infrastructure to support vulnerable youths before they break. And if the government's response was misguided, the public's reaction was just downright alarming. Just look at social media. Despite almost 100 injured kids and two explosives detonated, Indonesians instantly turned the entire tragedy into a tragic meme. People mocked the attacker's appearance, laughed at his cringe references, joked about the For Agartha slogan on his rifle, and spread memes about the incident on social media. Someone dead ass cosplayed this guy at an anime convention a week ago. It's as if though the country collectively rejected the seriousness of what happened simply because the perpetrator looked just too ridiculous. And the attack felt way too Western to be real. Humor became a way to avoid confronting the fact that an Indonesian teenager had successfully radicalized himself using an ideology most Indonesians barely understand. And this is where the Indonesian media failed spectacularly. Instead of educating the public on far-right extremism, they sensationalized the entire spectacle. Instead of explaining how online pipelines radicalize isolated youths, they obsess over whether the kid played PUBG or not. And instead of acknowledging that Western far-right ideology is bleeding into Indonesia, a country long conditioned to blame everything on communism or religious extremism, they dismissed it as just kids playing around. By turning a near mass casualty event into entertainment, Indonesia proved exactly why this was able to happen in the first place. We don't take modern radicalization seriously. We laugh at the surface and ignore the structure underneath it. But if we keep doing that, if we keep joking, dismissing, blaming the wrong things, this will not be the last case. It will be the first warning we refuse to hear. This incident at 72nd High should be treated as a warning, not an anomaly. Because if Indonesia continues ignoring the growing digital undercurrent shaping its youths, we will see more of this in the future. Anyone who spends even 5 minutes on Discord, Reddit, or Instagram, they would know what I'm talking about. Many Indonesian youths normalize admiring far-right ideology, Nazi aesthetics, and fascist esotericism, which is often framed as irony, memes, or just edgy aesthetics, but still left completely unchecked by the broader public. We cannot keep assuming these kids will simply just grow out of it, or that extremism actually fades with age. Some of these teenagers will actually become adults who still carry the same resentment, the same ideological fantasies, and the same radical frameworks that shaped their adolescence. And Indonesia needs to stop pretending that Western extremist subcultures can't actually reach us. Schools must recognize the early warning signs. Parents must understand the digital worlds their children live in. And society as a whole must just stop dismissing this as issues or as jokes or as phases. If we don't take this seriously now, the next tragedy will not be a question of if, but only when.